After every major turning point in the Middle East, we hear the same thing. This time is different. After the Arab Spring, after the fall of President Mubarak in Egypt, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and Bashar Assad in Syria. But each time, expectations run ahead of reality, and the region reacts in ways few predict. So why does that keep happening, and what are we missing? Today, I'm excited to be with Daniel Kurtzer. He served as U.S. ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. He's advised presidents, worked on peace efforts, and seen firsthand how moments of optimism in the region can rise and unravel. He's now a professor at Princeton. Welcome, Dan, and thanks so much for joining Three Takeaways again today.
My pleasure, Lynn. It's good to be back.
Let's start with regime change. In countries where longtime dictators fell, Egypt, Libya, Iraq, Syria, did those countries end up with more stable, democratic, or chaotic governments? And are their people actually better off economically?
There's no one-size-fits-all for discussion of regime change because revolutions or coups d'etat are different in every situation. In the area that I study and used to work in, the Middle East, regime change has almost never resulted in either better governance or a more equitable distribution of economic benefits to the people in that country. The last big opportunity for that change occurred during what was called the Arab Spring, which started in 2011 with the ouster of the Tunisian president and then the ouster of President Mubarak in Egypt. Tunis offered an interesting moment of opportunity because the government that emerged after President Ben Ali ran away, that government included a wide array of different factions within the society, including the Islamists, who did not dominate the government, but it was important that they participated in the government. The problem is that over time, that model proved unsustainable, and Tunisia has largely slipped back into a quasi-authoritarian state. It's not as deeply entrenched authoritarianism as existed under Ben Ali, but it certainly isn't on the road to open democracy. In Egypt, there also was a very brief moment when President Mubarak was ousted, and the military, which temporarily took control, allowed elections which for the first time in Egypt were totally free and fair, and 2/3, maybe 3/4 actually, of the parliament that was elected were Islamists of different shades, the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafists, who were a different variety. And then the president who was elected came from the Muslim Brotherhood, but he acted in a manner that frightened a large proportion of the Egyptian public, wanting to instill Islamic practice in Egyptian society. It's a religious country, but they didn't want to become a kind of a Sunni variety of Iran. And in a couple of years, the Egyptian military ousted the president, and the military, in a sense, took control again, even though President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi shed his uniform, but it's a Praetorian state. The military governs from behind the throne of the president. There aren't other examples in the Middle East, which is one of the areas in the world where you have the most authoritarian governance. There are 8 monarchies of varying shades of authoritarianism. There are a number of republics, but they're not open society republics. Does regime change or do coups d'etat lead to better governance? And the answer is usually not. And that's largely because the people who can carry out the revolution, who have the guns, are not necessarily the small d Democrats.
And how about economic growth? Have the countries grown economically, and are the people better off after regime change?
There's no evidence of that anywhere in the region. I want to take you back to a long time ago when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. As a result of that, President George H.W. Bush said this will not stand. He drew a line in the sand, and ultimately a multinational military coalition booted Iraq out of Kuwait. I mention this now because in the run-up to the actual military confrontation, President Bush asked us in the State Department, I was then serving as a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Middle East Bureau, to think about what would emerge after the war. We were pretty sure we would win the military confrontation, but this president, to his credit, actually was thinking about the day after. And we did 4 different studies for him, one of which was the economic development of the region. And the basic question was, the Emir of Kuwait, a monarch, an authoritarian leader, had run away when Iraq invaded. He had gone to Saudi Arabia. And on the heels of an expected coalition victory, the argument would be that he should go back and rule again in Kuwait. And the president wanted to know if, in the course of restoring the Emir of Kuwait, could we redo Kuwait's economic model to provide better benefits to the rest of the region? And we did up a paper. The president ended up not adopting that as one of his major priorities. And I think the reason the president didn't is that he looked around and realized that he was only going to get a no from everybody in the region. The oil-rich and gas-rich countries would have gone through the roof if they thought that the United States was going to invade their treasury. Their sovereign wealth funds, largely invested outside of their countries in London, Geneva, New York, and so forth, would be shifted to protect their sovereign wealth. And I think they realized that in less than exigent circumstances, the United States simply couldn't seize those sovereign wealth funds, and thus there would be no interest on the part of these rich countries to share the wealth. So there's no real evidence that regime change brings about positive economic change.
If Iran is significantly weakened, what do you think actually changes and what stays the same?
Well, there are many different scenarios about not only the way this war will end, it could end at any moment, but what happens in the period after. And almost all of it will revolve around the degree of stability of the regime on the day after the war ends. It's highly unlikely, and I could be proved wrong even during this conversation, it's highly unlikely that this regime will collapse. Over the years, the Islamic Republic has built redundancy and various layers of institutional control and decentralized control into their system. There's 1 million men under arms in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and an untold number under arms in the more radical Basij. And as we saw a couple of months ago, when the opposition did go out in the streets, they don't carry arms, and therefore they were slaughtered. Somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people were simply mowed down by this regime. So looking at a post-war Iran, we're probably looking at some maybe slightly modified governance by this regime. In some respects, it'll be much more radical than what we had before the war, because the supreme leader's son, who's now the supreme leader, is a much more radical person than his father was. There may be a little bit of realization that the power disparity between Iran and the United States is great enough that they have to figure out something other than opposition to the existence of the United States and the existence of Israel. But I would not anticipate much other significant change in Iran. I think where there will be significant change will be the degree to which Arab Gulf states now have to rethink their national security concept. On the one hand, for quite some time to come, they're going to be reliant upon the United States for their defense. But then they're going to wonder how good an idea that is when the United States goes to war without even consulting them, and they bear part of the burden of the United States having gone to war.
Is there a risk that what looks like a win in the Middle East today is really just setting up the next round of conflict?
Well, I never nitpick the use of words, but I will in this case. There are no wins emerging from this war. At some point, President Trump will announce victory, but then he announced that we had won this war a few days after it started. So it'll be an empty comment or an empty pronouncement from the president. The Islamic Republic will announce that it won. It will announce victory because it survived. But the devastation that's been wrought on that country has set it back decades, if not more. So they'll be governing a broken country and a failed state. So there are no winners here. Everybody's a loser. And of course, in a much more narrow sense, you and I and our neighbors are losers because we're going to be paying much higher prices for the things that we were told by this president were going to come under control, the groceries and gas at the pump. It may stabilize in a few months, maybe. It may not stabilize in a few months because of the degree to which oil and gas facilities, both in Iran and in the Gulf, have now been destroyed. How long will it take to rebuild them? We're going to bear the burden as consumers and as citizens of this war far longer than governments are going to bear that burden.
Unlike Iran, some countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are evolving in very different ways. What's happening there, and why have they been as successful as they have been?
Well, I'd argue the jury is still out on the degree of success. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman some years ago announced a Saudi 30-30 vision in which the society would open up. There would be a better distribution of wealth. There would be a reduction on the reliance on fossil fuels, building up industry and the services and so forth. There was a major project undertaken to build not just a city, but a whole complex of cities along the Red Sea coast to move population from the internal area within the country to the periphery. And that has not worked very well. So the jury is definitely out on Saudi 30-30. The United Arab Emirates experiment was, until 4 weeks ago, far more successful because they decided some years ago that they would use their oil and gas wealth to become a transportation and tourism hub. And it was working. The world was looking at that area as a kind of crossroads for much of the commerce and commercial interaction. And now, if you were a business person, would you want to locate or relocate into Dubai, where the financial center was hit by Iranian rockets and where what looked like a very safe, comfortable, modern environment became the centerpiece of the war? You know, the numbers may change, but 4 weeks into this war, going on 5 weeks, the United Arab Emirates has been hit by more missiles and drones from Iran than Israel. And if you're a banker or a financial services person, you're going to run for cover and you're going to find someplace else to go. And Lynn, if you wanted an example of it, go back to the 1970s when Beirut was considered the Paris of the Middle East. And when civil war broke out in Lebanon, Beirut emptied out, all ran away because it was no longer a safe haven.
What do you think the impact of this war will be?
Well, it's going to have many impacts. First of all, there's again, even before the war ends, a reaffirmation of American military power, but also a reaffirmation of the degree to which the United States has either forgotten how to do diplomacy or is uninterested in diplomacy. And we can talk about that. But this president in particular, but he's not alone. Many of his predecessors as well preferred military solutions to the longer term, more difficult to achieve diplomatic outcomes that were messier, but they were obviously less destructive. Second, what's being called Israel's military dominance will also be reaffirmed. Under cover of this war, there's also a war going on between Israel and Lebanon. And not only is Iran and its infrastructure being destroyed, but Lebanon's infrastructure is being destroyed because the Lebanese government is too weak, perhaps unwilling, therefore, to disarm Hezbollah as it was supposed to do under terms of the 2024 ceasefire. And under cover of these two wars, there is a rush to annexation, de facto annexation by Israel in the West Bank, with very significant violence being done by some settlers against Palestinians. It's not going to calm down simply because the guns fall silent in Iran. A lot of rebuilding obviously will take place, but the rebuilding will only last as long as there is not a next war, and there's no guarantee that there won't be a next war.
And what will be the impact of all of these Iranian attacks on Arab countries in the area?
There's an argument that the Israelis were pushing Trump to do this. My colleague Aaron Miller and I, we've published some articles together, and there's another one that's going to come out this week that will make the case that Netanyahu did not push Trump to do anything that Trump didn't want to do himself. There's credible evidence that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia was also pushing Trump to go to war, except he did it quietly. Netanyahu did it from a loud podium, and MBS, as he's called, did it quietly, in large part because in Israel, going to war against Iran was and remains popular. And Saudi Arabia going to war against Iran is not popular, and therefore the leadership was not reflecting the mood of the people. And it's also quite possible that if the Arab Emirates, United Arab Emirates, weren't pushing from the beginning, they certainly have been supportive of the continuation of the war. One of their leading think tank experts, Anwar Gargash, said the other day that this war can't end with Iran remaining a military power. That obviously reflects their anger at what has happened to them as a result of the war. So Arab attitudes towards Iran will certainly harden in the short term. But as I noted earlier, even as their reliance on the U.S. for their defense remains intact, they're going to have to figure out how to deal with Iran other than relying upon the United States to periodically go to war. And I don't know what form that's going to take.
And as you mentioned, Iran has lobbed more missiles and drones at Arab countries than it has at Israel.
You hope that there were planners in Washington who anticipated this, maybe among various options. If you're planning, you don't ever fixate on one option or one possibility. But I hope that there were planners who sat down and said, if I were Iran, how would I react to an American-Israeli strike? And they should have expected, at least in one of the options or scenarios, asymmetrical responses. So we attack Iran, and Iran then attacks our friends. We go after some of Iran's energy capabilities, and they attack the energy capabilities of our friends. There was a direct response when Israel attacked the South Pars gas field in the Persian Gulf. The next day, the Iranians attacked gas facilities in Qatar and in Kuwait. And it's not an irrational response on the part of Iran. You look at other factors, the amount of money that we spend in countering their ballistic missiles and their drones relative to the cost of their building these ballistic missiles, and particularly the drones. The drones cost a pittance, and we're firing $2 or $3 million missiles to knock these things down. And Iran is now using swarm tactics, as the Ukrainians are doing against Russia. Everybody learns from everybody else. And so they'll send hundreds of these drones. It may cost them a couple of $100,000. They're going to lose most of the drones, but some of them are going to get through. And there aren't enough countermeasures available to us with our high technology that can deal with a swarm of drones. So, you ask about the Arab Gulf states and their future. Start building very inexpensive counter-drone technology. I read something the other day. There is now technology where there's a company that's building through 3D printing. They're building high-tech weaponry through 3D printing. That weaponry used to cost X number of millions and is now costing X number of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we're going to have to adapt, and our allies will have to adapt as well.
The Middle East is unique in having so many monarchies. What impact does that have?
Well, interestingly, at the time of the Arab Spring, starting in 2011, 7 of the most stable countries in the Middle East were the monarchies. The only place where there were some disruptions were in Bahrain, which has a majority Shia population. The Sunnis run the place, and the Shia are the majority. And the Saudis immediately sent forces over the causeway, and they put down that uprising. The other 7 monarchies, 6 of them in the Gulf, Jordan, and Morocco, were all remarkably stable. Academics and think tanks are trying to figure out why. One factor is that most of these monarchs derive some legitimacy from religion, particularly in Jordan and Morocco, where the kings can draw a line almost back to the Prophet Muhammad. And that means something in a traditional religion-based society. In the Gulf, it's a little bit different. The lineage is not as clear, but the family orientation, the family power structure has been there before these places became kingdoms or emirates. They were all fishing villages dominated by some coalition of major families which had legitimacy to govern. And then the British came along and pronounced the fishing village head to be the king or the emir, and they retained that kind of legitimacy. But it is an interesting phenomenon, and one that has kept these places relatively stable and calm during these periods of upheaval in the region.
People are talking about a new Middle East. You don't buy it. What are they missing?
Well, I was serving in government when President George H.W. Bush declared there would be a new Middle East, and he gave some major speeches about it. And we actually thought it could happen. It was the period of the end of the Soviet Union. The U.S. was the only superpower. We had knocked Iraq out of Kuwait. We brought about the Madrid Peace Conference. We looked like we were on a roll. And the Middle East soon slid back into very familiar forms. I don't see the Middle East today as being at an inflection point. You and I exchanged emails on an article that Aaron Miller and I wrote about not expecting significant change, however this war ends. And almost all of our argument rests on the structural factors that prevent change in the region. What we didn't focus on a great deal is the fact that almost all of the social and economic ills that people in the Middle East have beset them for decades without much change. I came to Princeton University in 2006, right after retiring from the Foreign Service. And one of the first talks I gave at Princeton was on the conditions in the Middle East that seemed impervious to change. Corruption, crony capitalism, poverty, discrimination against women in education and employment, authoritarianism. I went down a list of these things. And it came at a time, my talk in Princeton came at a time when the UN Development Program was going through an exercise of having people from the Middle East try to define what was wrong with their societies, not having outsiders do that, but kind of looking in the mirror. And they started that in 2002. By 2006, they had done, I think, the second or third study. And I could give that speech today, and there's been very little change in any of the metrics that were being suggested in these studies. They particularly focused on three deficits in Arab societies. A deficit of freedom goes back to our discussion of democracy and openness. It's not a very good report card. A deficit of what they called knowledge, which really was a deficit of an education system that was not training people in the Middle East to cope with emerging technologies and emerging changes. A lot of rote memorization, and that hasn't changed very much. And there was a deficit of women's empowerment. In most Middle East societies, women still don't participate fully in any aspect of the society. Some places are better than others. In Egypt, the women can drive and they can go to universities and they can work in many professions, but not all professions. In some Gulf countries, that's the case, but in other places, it's not the case. And that hasn't changed very much.
And looking ahead, what does a realistic best case scenario look like 5 or 10 years from now for the Middle East?
I think much of any scenario planning is going to depend on the degree to which we in the United States move away from unilateralism to multilateralism. When we have tried to deal with problems multilaterally, we've had some success. I go back, for example, to the period after the Madrid Peace Conference when we started the multilateral peace talks and the economic public-private summits that took place. There were 4 of them in the region. And it looked like we had found, a methodology for getting people's attention and denying them an easy exit. In other words, if the United States and Europe and Japan and South Korea and even China are lining up in favor of economic change or maybe a more open society or a different social contract, it's going to be really hard for people in different societies to push back against that. The United States does it alone. These countries have choices. China had a Belt and Road Initiative, and they have ways of investment, which is attractive to some of these countries. So I think one of the most important keys to looking at the longer term is thinking about a multilateral, a multinational approach to almost everything that we do. And it's not just economic matters, it's also on security. After the first Gulf War, we thought about multilateralizing Gulf security so that it wouldn't rest only on the United States to protect these countries, and that didn't work very well. But why not revive the concept and just do it better? These countries ought to be responsible for more of their own security. They probably can't be responsible for all of their security, but there's no reason we have to carry everybody. Working with them over time, multilaterally, in a regional security architecture is probably much wiser than simply selling them arms and then being their protecting umbrella if people start to shoot at them.
Dan, what are the 3 takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Well, one takeaway is not to expect a fundamental change after this war in the way the region is organized, either in its politics or in its economics. The problems that beset these societies are persistent and endemic, and it would require the kind of leadership that we haven't seen on the part of regional leaders or extra-regional leaders to effect change, number one. Number two, and I say this with great regret, that military power will continue to dominate the discourse in this region rather than diplomacy. And we've seen that now. Hamas's attack on Israel in 2023, Israel's war in Gaza, the war in Lebanon, the war in Iran. In each case, there were at least feeble attempts at diplomacy, but at the end of the day, it always returned to the military. The third takeaway is the weakness of leadership in the region and at home. And I don't say that in partisan terms, but rather the fact that we have a country that's not producing the kinds of leaders who think beyond their party narrative, who think beyond what's going to happen in the next election. And you have weak leaders in the region who are afraid of their own publics and therefore unwilling to extend themselves and enter into processes that could possibly lead to positive change.
Do you accept at all Saudi Arabia, where they have made huge progress with respect to women, or not?
I'll only accept Saudi Arabia if you invite me back in a year and we can see what happens between now and a year. Because right now, my personal jury is out. And I frankly don't see Mohammed bin Salman as a reformist. I think he talks the talk, but I'm still waiting to see the full walking the walk.
Dan, I am happy to invite you back in a year. Thank you for joining 3 Takeaways today, and thank you also for your service in government.
Thanks, Lynn.